Hello and welcome to yet another day of the 30-day myofascial release challenge. Today I'm going to be emphasizing yet another muscle that tends to get really tight on people, oftenly ignored, and many people seem to be concerned with something specifically like an anterior pelvic tilt, and I'm going to show you guys how to attack an anterior pelvic tilt with the release of this specific section of this muscle. So it's important to consider that anterior tilts, oftentimes people will consider that to being a hip flexor restriction, and it is. But we got to be very precise on what areas we're actually releasing, because sometimes we may release a muscle that has nothing to do with an anterior tilt. If we think about the way muscles function and where they pull from, sometimes a hip flexor does not, a hip flexor may do hip flexion, but it may not actually manipulate the pelvis. I can't get too deep into the specifics of that because it gets really dense, but you guys will just have to take my word for it for the time being, but I'll be explaining it as I go along. So most of the time, the common way that we usually address the hip flexors is usually by releasing the belly of the quadricep, which can be advantageous. It can help if you start releasing right here, this front portion of the thigh. However, if you think about the line of tension of what's actually pulling the pelvis downward, we have to think that the origin of that pull coming downward doesn't come from the belly of the muscle. It actually is going to come proximal to the knee joint. So if you could just imagine a string of tissues pulling down this way, pulling down like this, that's what's going to bring the ASIS downward into that anterior pelvic tilt, okay? So if this lengthens, right? If the tissues from the knee joint pull my pelvis down this way, that's what lengthens the fibers of that rectus femoris, which is what we're going to be releasing. But if we think about what's going to influence the anterior pelvic tilt, it's going to be the lower fibers that are pulling down from here. Okay, so you guys can just imagine that that's what's pulling you into an anterior pelvic tilt. So if we're going to talk about specific locations that you want to release in order to correct that anterior pelvic tilt, this is probably going to be one of those areas. Now we can also think about the same thing in regards to the psoas. What areas of the psoas need to be manipulated? The iliacus, the tensor fasciolata. What spectrums of those tissues actually need to be released? I'm not going to get into that. We're just going to be focusing on this one release right here. It will be of great importance. So all we're going to do, again, going back to that trusty lacrosse ball, I'm going to be laying down face down here, and then I'm just going to let my body fall right there proximal to the knee joint. Okay, it's going to be nice and close to the knee, and I'm going to just allow gravity to do its thing here. Now if I really want to expose the fibers there, I'm going to do this very slowly, not fast, because if you go fast, the tissues don't seem to penetrate inward. The lacrosse ball won't penetrate into the tissues seemingly well enough. So what I want you guys to do is go in super slow motion, cueing somewhat of an activation of your hamstring. Kind of like you can do this with your bicep. Try doing the same thing with your hamstring. And you're going to see us slowly bring that heel towards your butt. You can also put a band behind you. My boy William Menzies from London, he wound up coming up with a pretty cool idea where you put a band behind your hamstring. Or I could have been another guy, FP Shannon. He's on Instagram. He does some pretty cool stuff too. But I'm not sure where I could have gotten this idea from. But you can't even put a band behind your ankle and have it pulling it that way, and that can give you a little bit more of an active component. But if you just go super slow motion, you can still get quite a bit of an effective release. And again, the point is just getting right off of where that kneecap is. You could even maybe do some release on the patellar tendon. Some people say it's good, some people say it's not so good, but I think it could be good too. But this area right here will orient a lot of that line of pull. Okay, so there is yet another release. Just think, that's where the line of pull, depending on your distortions, that's typically where the line of pull is going to be if you're thinking about creating an anterior pelvic tilt with your rectus femoris. If you have problems with your knees, if you have problems with your lower back in general, you have a stiff lower back, this biomechanically will influence those pains that are typically there. And I mean, of course, there's a difference between chronic and acute pain, which has kind of been all the topic of conversation right now. But based upon what we do with functional patterns, we tend to fix people biomechanically with their chronic conditions. So if you are chronically tight in these areas, that's pulling your pelvis like this, and you are tight constantly, then automatically that's going to potentially lead to a chronic condition of dysfunction that could eventually lead you to end up having pain. So getting in here and breaking that stuff up will enable that ASIS to kind of drift back a little bit more and give you probably a little bit better function of the glute max on that function of extension. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you guys very soon. Take care.